Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Shaheen and members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be here today representing the men and women of the FBI. Our people, nearly 37,000 of them, are the heart of the Bureau. And every day I see them tackling their jobs with perseverance, with professionalism, and with integrity. And I've now had the opportunity to visit all 56 of our FBI field offices over the past year and a half, and not just meeting with our folks, but also meeting with state and local law enforcement partners for every state represented on this subcommittee and people in your communities, and to hear from them about the issues that matter most to them. And I'm grateful for their support and their insights as we work together to keep 325 million Americans safe and to help make our communities stronger. I want to thank this subcommittee for the funding you've provided in the past. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to do all the important work we do. As this subcommittee knows, we face unprecedented threats from homegrown violent extremists to domestic terrorists, foreign terrorist organizations, hostile foreign intelligence services, cyber criminals, violent gangs, white-collar criminals, child predators, and the list just goes on and on. All of these threats are ever-changing. We've got to be even more agile and predictive. We've also got to help our law enforcement partners in your districts, across the country, and around the world. And we can't do any of that without your support. There are lots of areas where we need help, but there are 4 areas in particular where I'm particularly interested in working with this subcommittee to ensure that we have sufficient resources. First, cyber and analytics. Second, transnational organized crime. Third, counterintelligence. And fourth, technology investments. Given the extensive threats we face, the expectations for the FBI have never been higher. The men and women of the FBI, in my experience, continue to meet and exceed those expectations every day. So thank you for this opportunity to discuss their work. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me begin with follow up on the hearing we had last week with Attorney General Barr. A few weeks ago in that budget hearing, he indicated that he believes spying on the Trump campaign did occur in the 2016 election, and the question was whether that spying was legal. The Attorney General stated he intended to look into the legality of these actions, and I believe that's of value. Have you initiated any internal reviews of the FBI's action during the 2016 election?
Well, Mr. Chairman, there are a couple things going on. First, there is, of course, the ongoing Inspector General's investigation that's being conducted by the independent Office of Inspector General, and our folks are assisting them with their effort. And then second, as you alluded to, now that the special counsel investigation is completed and having only recently returned to the department, the Attorney General is seeking to understand better the circumstances at the department and the FBI relating to how this investigation started. And we're working to help him get that understanding. I think that's part of his job and part of mine.
The Mueller report, as you indicated, has been released. Could you elaborate on it? And it did find that the Russians did interfere with the 2016 election. Could you please elaborate on the FBI's role in election security and actions taken by the Bureau during the 2016 election to mitigate foreign interference?
Well, as to the 2016 election, I think I'll let the special counsel's report speak for itself. You know, it's 450 pages long, represents a lot of hard work by a large team of professionals over almost 2 years. But one of the things that I set in motion almost immediately after starting in this role was to create a foreign influence task force, which is a measure not just of how seriously I take and we take the foreign malign influence threat, but also I think a recognition of the need for better coordination. This is a multidisciplinary problem requiring a multidisciplinary solution. So the Foreign Influence Task Force brings together our cyber, resources, our counterintelligence resources, our criminal resources, and even our counterterrorism resources, because there's a little bit of a domestic terrorism wrinkle to some of this. And it acts as sort of the hub with the spokes going out to our field offices and coordinating with Department of Homeland Security, ODNI, NSA, and in particular working much more closely with state and local election officials, along with Department of Homeland Security and the tech sector in Silicon Valley, because on the foreign influence threat in particular, I think it's very important for Americans to understand that this is a threat that is not just a government threat. We need to have the partnership with the social media companies in particular, and we've had really significant progress in that regard going into the midterms, and there were a lot of successes in the 2018 midterms through that kind of team effort.
Is the election interference broader than just, when we talk about foreign interference in our elections, is it broader than just Russia?
Well, there's different kinds of malign foreign influence. Certainly other countries, other adversaries are engaged in different kinds of malign foreign influence. The specific form of sowing divisiveness and discord through the bullhorn that social media provides, the trolls, bots, et cetera, that was something that was really fairly unique to the Russians. But certainly we know that other countries have been eyeing those efforts and entertaining whether or not to take a page out of that book.
Director, when you appeared before this subcommittee last year, I asked you about issues related to the Nasser investigation, Dr. Nasser and the Olympics. You indicated an answer was difficult to give because of an OIG investigation. Since that time, the FBI has conducted an internal investigation that led to that review by the Inspector General, and we await that conclusion. I guess at this point, unless you're willing to share more information than you were a year ago in this regard, which I would welcome hearing from you, beyond that, I would ask you to assure me that the FBI will prioritize and take the OIG's results and recommendations seriously.
Well, certainly, Mr. Chairman, first I should say that our heart breaks and aches for the victims of that particular matter. As you said, there's an independent Inspector General investigation going on into the handling of that matter, and I expect to take very seriously the recommendations that we get out of the Office of Inspector General, but that's very much still an ongoing review.
Thank you, sir. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Wray, for being here this morning. I'd like to follow up on Senator Moran's question about the hearing we had with Attorney General Barr, because I was very concerned by his use of the word spying, which I think is a very loaded word. It conjures a criminal connotation. And I want to ask you, and I'd appreciate a yes or no answer if possible, when FBI agents conduct investigations against alleged mobsters, suspected terrorists, other criminals, do you believe that they're engaging in spying when they're following FBI investigative policies and procedures?
Well, that's not the term I would use.
Thank you. So I would say that's a no to that question.
Well, I mean, look, there are lots of people have different colloquial phrases. I believe that the FBI is engaged in investigative activity, and part of investigative activity includes surveillance activity of different shapes and sizes. And to me, the key question is making sure that it's done by the book, consistent with our lawful authorities. That's the key question. Different people use different colloquial phrases.
And as part of the investigative process, do FBI agents secure warrants for relevant evidence?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, as part of an investigative process, like the investigative process into the 2016 presidential campaign, do FBI agents secure warrants for relevant evidence?
Certainly, securing warrants is a very important step that we take every day in the FBI in lots and lots of investigations.
So I would take that as a yes. Did FBI agents get warrants for information as part of their counter-surveillance investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election?
Well, I want to be a little bit careful about what I can discuss here, but I think it's been publicly disclosed that there were a number of relevant warrants that were secured in the course of that investigation.
Thank you. And do you believe, Director Wray, that the FBI and its agents spied into the 2016 presidential campaign operation?
Well, again, I want to be careful about how I answer that question here because there is an ongoing Inspector General investigation. I have my own thoughts based on limited information I've seen so far, but I don't think it would be ripe or appropriate for me to share those at this stage because I really do think it's important for everybody to respect the independent Inspector General's investigation, which I think this line of questioning starts to implicate, and I think it's very important for everybody to be able to have full confidence in his review.
And at this time, do you have any evidence that any illegal surveillance into the campaigns or individuals associated with the campaigns by the FBI occurred?
I don't think I personally have any evidence of that sort.
Thank you. Now, again, the Attorney General stated that he was assembling a team to look into the situation of illegal surveillance into the Trump presidential campaign and stated that he expected to work closely with you on this. Has the Attorney General asked you to look into or review the actions undertaken by the FBI regarding the counterintelligence investigation?
Well, as I said, he's trying to get a better understanding of the circumstances at the department and the FBI surrounding the initiation of this particular investigation. He and I have been in fairly close contact about it, and we're trying to work together to help him get the understanding that he needs on that subject. I think that's appropriate.
As you pointed out, the evidence in the Mueller report is very clear that the Russians interfered in our 2016 election, and there have been a variety of news reports suggesting that they intend to do that again. We've had testimony in the Armed Services Committee about their interest in interfering in the 2020 election. Can you talk about what the FBI is doing to coordinate with other branches within government a response to ensure that that does not happen in the 2020 election?
Well, I appreciate the question. I agree with you that this is a particularly important issue. I think one of the things that people out there would benefit from understanding is that this is not just an election cycle threat, that the malign foreign influence threat, which is different from some effort to interfere with election infrastructure, is something that continues pretty much 365 days a year, and we've seen it continue since 2016. And we expect it to continue going into 2020. The Foreign Influence Task Force that I set up at the FBI works very closely with a similar kind of vehicle at the Department of Homeland Security and similar structures at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and at NSA. So those four agencies in particular are kind of the key ones, kind of at the center of this. But then we work closely with, as I said to the chairman, with Silicon Valley on the foreign influence side, and then DHS in particular works with state and local election officials on some of the election infrastructure piece. So there's a lot of activity, better coordination in my view than what I found when I first walked in the door. But we make no mistake, the threat just keeps escalating, and we're going to have to keep upping our game to stay ahead of it.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but can you just tell me who is in charge of that effort? So is there one person who's been designated to coordinate all of those efforts?
Well, I think each of us has our piece of it. We coordinate closely together, much as we do on, say, counterterrorism or any number of other national security threats.
So does that mean that there's currently not one person who has been designated as the leader of that effort?
Well, the FBI has the lead on foreign influence. The Department of Homeland Security takes the lead on election infrastructure hardening and so forth. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence takes the lead in terms of intelligence analysis. But like I said, in my experience, not unlike we do with any number of other threats facing this country, we all work together, and each of us has our piece of the pie, which I think is the way it should be.
Thank you.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, I want to follow up on the point that was just made by my two colleagues. Here are the facts as I see them. We know that the Russians were relentless in their efforts to influence the 2016 campaign and to further divide and polarize our society. We know that this effort did not end with the 2016 campaign. It both preceded it and continues to this very day. Third, we know that it's not just the Russians, that other foreign states and other malicious actors are targeting our democratic society. There are 17 intelligence agencies, and each of them seems to have a piece of this. You talked about that just now. It concerns me that there is not one agency that is in charge of the overall strategy. Should that be the FBI?
Well, Senator Collins, first let me say I agree with your framing of the predicament that we face in terms of the threat itself. In terms of coordination, I think the FBI has a lead role to play in aspects of that. I think the NSC provides a useful construct for us to coordinate. I have not found a significant impediment to our coordination with Department of Homeland Security, NSA in particular, and ODNI. And I have found that to be fairly similar to, as I say, the way we deal with counterterrorism and a number of other national security threats. So at the moment, that hasn't struck me as one of the biggest barriers we face. I think the bigger issues for us are making sure that we continue to lean in our working with Silicon Valley in the tech sector on the foreign influence side and with the state and local election officials who, after all, really control the election infrastructure side. I think that part of it is where we need to keep upping our game as we anticipate 2020, the threat being even more challenging than it has been.
So let me ask you, what key lessons has the FBI learned to date that we should be implementing right now?
Well, certainly, I'll speak to the foreign influence piece in particular. I think that there is enormous value to be had in our cooperation with the tech sector and social media in particular on the foreign influence threat. The reality is foreign influence, malign foreign influence, as you, I think, quite rightly summarize, is not unique to this particular moment in time, nor unique to this particular foreign adversary. But what is different right now is the incredible amplification that our adversaries get through social media. And so one of the things that changed dramatically from 16 to 18 was our coordination with social media in terms of blunting and mitigating that effect. And what we saw in 2018, which I think we're going to need to do even more of in 2020 in terms of lessons, is that when we supply leads and information to the social media companies, there's all kinds of ways they can leverage their own tools and kick some of these accounts off of their platforms very, very quickly in a way that would be hard for any agency of government to do. And there were a lot of success stories in that regard in 2018. In return, one of the things we learned was that they were then able to provide us lead information about accounts that we might not have known about, techniques we might not have seen. And so you start creating this sort of virtuous cycle. And I think now, having figured that out, with the midterms, we need to see even more of that for 2020.
That cooperation is essential with the private sector. Let me turn to a different issue very quickly. Last week in Maine, the FBI and Maine law enforcement charged 25 individuals with drug trafficking crimes. And particularly alarming to me is the quantity of fentanyl that was discovered. One man was found to have more than 265 grams of fentanyl. A fraction of that amount, just 3 milligrams, is sufficient to kill someone. How is the FBI targeting resources specifically toward fentanyl crimes?
So, Senator, I think you've put your finger on what I think we would all agree is a deadly epidemic plaguing communities all over the country. It requires, unfortunately, it has grown to a point where it's a multidisciplinary problem requiring multidisciplinary approach. The FBI's role in that is trying to really focus on where do we uniquely add value. And so there's a number of things we're doing on that. First, we have a prescription drug initiative that's geared towards essentially medical providers, medical professionals, pharmacists, pill mills, doctors, et cetera, who are over-prescribing, which is a big part of the spinning up of this problem. And we tap into our healthcare fraud expertise and resources there. Second, we have Safe Streets task forces all over the country which focus on dismantling the gangs that distribute opioids and fentanyl-related substances all over the country. Third, we have something called J-Code, which features prominently in our budget request, I might mention, which is focused on the dark net, because a lot of the opioid trafficking happens on the dark net, more and more so. And we've had a number of successful operations. We just had a couple in the last few months that really are aimed at detecting, disrupting, and dismantling both the enterprises that are dependent on the dark net to traffic in opioids and fentanyl, but also to break down their supply chains. And then fourth, we have, through our transnational organized crime program, we focus on the transnational criminal organizations, which are the principal source of the supply coming into the U.S. We also have things like, we did a documentary with DEA called Chasing the Dragon, which we've pushed out to schools all over the country to try to raise awareness that way. So there's a lot of different things we're trying to do, but make no mistake, this is a problem that has mushroomed to a degree where it's going to really require all hands on deck.
Thank you.
I recognize the Vice Chairman of the full committee, Senator Leahy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Director Wray, good to see you again. It's interesting listening to the evolution of the FBI. I remember as a young prosecutor, I was on the executive board of the National DA's Association having a meeting with J. Edgar Hoover. He told us there was no such thing as organized crime. Our biggest problems were hippies and communists. And the New York Times was close to being a communist paper, and he was preparing to investigate it as such. It was an interesting conversation for many reasons. He passed away shortly thereafter. Now, one of my concerns following last week's hearing with the Attorney General is a reluctance on the part of the administration, starting at the top, to acknowledge what Russia did was wrong. An American campaign knowingly benefiting from or encouraging a foreign adversary's attack on our elections is also wrong. In fact, quite wrong. I think we'd all agree. 2020 is around the corner. Friday, the president had a long conversation with Russian President Putin. He didn't even bring up future election interference. He refers to the last investigation as treasonous, claims the FBI was leading a coup. I suspect that you probably have a different view of this. I think those who are going to enforce our laws have to be crystal clear about the ongoing threat. So I'm going to ask you this. If a foreign government offers assistance to a political campaign, opposition research, stolen information, social media campaign, or otherwise, what would you as director of the FBI, if you discovered it, ask that campaign to do?
Well, Senator, as I think I said even back to my confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee.
That's why I asked the question.
When Senator Graham asked me a similar question then, I think my view is that if any public official or member of any campaign is contacted by any nation state or anybody acting on behalf of a nation state about influencing or interfering with our election, then that's something that the FBI would want to know about.
And if they did not make it such things available to the FBI and you found out about it later, would that trouble you?
Well, as I said, we'd like to make sure people tell us information promptly so that we can take appropriate steps to protect the American people.
The president said he would like to use the Justice Department as a political weapon targeting his opponent. And I know the Attorney General has been asked about this. Has the White House ever communicated to you, directly or indirectly, any desire or interest in having the FBI initiate an investigation of anyone?
Not that I can think of. Certainly, there's all kinds of public commentary, but, you know, my view is we base our investigations on the facts, the evidence, and proper predication, and that's been my practice since the day I walked in the door.
I asked the question only because I like to think it's a different FBI than the first time I sat down with an FBI director and with J. Edgar Hoover and heard his discussions of obviously being interested in political investigations. Is it your position you would not be willing to have the FBI initiate an investigation that's done for political purpose, not for a criminal purpose?
My strong view and my commitment is to making sure that the FBI, under my leadership, does things by the book, and that includes making sure that we base our investigations on proper predication, the facts, the evidence, and adherence to the rule of law, and nothing else.
Thank you. The Hate Crime Statistics Act requires hate crimes to be reported to the FBI. But we find that in 2017, 16,000 law enforcement agencies in the country, 14,000 did not report hate crimes to you. Well, the Crime Victimization Survey estimates more than 250,000 hate crimes. Now, you were able to only report 7,175 based on what was reported to you. Are you concerned that that these hate crimes are not being reported to you? And if you are concerned about it, how do we improve them?
So it's a good question. I do think that historically hate crimes have gone underreported. I think that's probably still true to a certain extent. I do think it's getting better, so some of the uptick in numbers reported may reflect closing the gap between what's happening and what's being reported. We have tried to do a number of things, to the second part of your question, to try to raise awareness out with state and local law enforcement, with community groups and so forth, to try to increase the likelihood that hate crimes will be reported. I'm a big believer in the idea that everybody benefits, law enforcement, the community, et cetera, when discussions about these things are based on the facts and the real data, as opposed to relying instead on what would fill the gap otherwise, which is just media commentary, which I have found to be much less reliable.
Thank you. And on a personal matter, Mr. Chairman, I have to applaud the video you put out talking about the shutdown. When you talked to the men and women of the FBI, you said the shutdown was mind-boggling, short-sighted, unfair. When Senator Shelby and I, with our two counterparts from the House, met in my office to broker a deal that stopped the shutdown, you had both Republicans and Democrats applauding what you said to the FBI's. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. In order for us to have plenty of time for the executive session, I'm going to, now that Senator Leahy and Senator Shaheen have completed their question, I'm going to try to hold everybody to their 5 minutes, better than I have so far to date. Senator Boozman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director, for being here very, very much. As you know, we in Arkansas, as well as every other state in the union, is struggling with our communities are struggling with violent crime and the substance abuse epidemic that we have going on. In your testimony, you mentioned state, local, tribal law enforcement partners is crucial to the FBI to better understand a community and their needs. Can you elaborate on the partnerships and task forces that are created within these communities? How does the Bureau work across jurisdictions and communities to do this very, very important work? in fighting against these things.
Well, Senator, I think you have rightly identified a really significant problem facing this country. I've had the opportunity to visit the Little Rock field office and meet with state and local law enforcement there to talk about this very issue. And there's some very good work, even within a whole FBI of good work, some particularly good work being done on the violent crime problem in the Little Rock area. I think the keys to the violent crime problem, from my perspective, are number one, partnership, and number two, intelligence. By that meaning intelligence driving prioritization. So one of the things we have found is that in almost every community around the country, and it's true in Little Rock, but it's true in every community in this nation, is that there's almost always some tail or tails that are wagging the dog, right. Meaning some particular gang that's disproportionately accounting for the homicide rate, or some particular neighborhood, or some particular corridor on a highway. I mean, it varies from community to community, but what it doesn't vary is that there's always that disproportionate effect. And so using good intelligence to prioritize and be disciplined about where we're going to maximize our impact, and then taking the partnership with state and local law enforcement to, as I like to say, not just put 2 + 2 to get 4, but get 2 + 2 to make 5 or 6 or 7 by finding synergies. And that's what's happening in the Little Rock area. That's what's happening in a number of the other communities represented up here on this subcommittee. And that's where you start to see very promising reductions in the violent crime rate, the assault rate, the homicide rate, sometimes in a very short period of time. And that translates to kids who can go out in the front yard and play after dark, and people who can walk home, and people who don't have to be afraid in their own neighborhoods. And that's the impact we're after.
One of the things that seems to be at play right now in a very, very significant way is the mail. And our postal authorities, postal inspectors do a great job. They don't have a lot of resources. Is that something that we do have coordination with people like you and the rest of the agencies?
I'm sorry, the coordination between us and
the postal inspector. So much of this is mail oriented.
Oh, I see.
Now. You know, as I visit with my county sheriffs and others, particularly out in really every place. But it seems like that's an area that perhaps we haven't, again, not because our postal inspectors are not doing a good job. They haven't had a lot of resources. Are we coordinating to somehow try and bring that under control?
We are. We have actually, and I go back to my earliest days as a baby prosecutor working with postal inspection agents. So they're an incredibly great partner. I would say that, I'll just give one good example, the Cesar Sayoc investigation from back in the fall, the sort of package IED cases that got so much attention around the country. We worked incredibly closely with Postal there to help each other to, again, get that 2 + 2 to get 5 or 6 effect. And there was a lot of great work there done, not just by the FBI's folks, but by Postal.
Your budget is fairly modest. How can we help you?
Well, there are a number of places where we really need significant help. I mentioned a few in my opening statement. On the cyber side, I would say that the threat has grown exponentially in terms of actors, methods, targets, and so we need personnel and tools there in a big, big way. And just to give you some frame of reference in terms of the data context, you know, the entire Library of Congress has about 7 petabytes of data. The Las Vegas shooting, which everybody on this subcommittee is familiar with, just that one investigation generated 1 petabyte of data. That's one investigation out of the thousands we do. So we're in serious need of both cyber tools and data analytic tools. On the counterintelligence side, we're facing a uniquely challenging time in terms of foreign investment, foreign influence, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. I could go on and on there. We have resources that we're asking for there. We really need help. Transnational organized crime is something that is diversifying every time we turn around, affects Americans every day. I mentioned the J-Code initiative in response to Senator Collins's question about the dark net, so we need help there. And then again, modernizing our IT. It's not glamorous, but in today's world, technology is at the heart of every threat we're all concerned about, and we need to be able to stay ahead of it, because if we start falling behind, people are less safe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Director. The special counsel report on the investigation into Russian interference in 2016 presidential election concluded, and I quote, "The Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome." The report detailed two primary information warfare operations, one of which was, in their words, a Russian entity that carried out a social media campaign that favored presidential candidate Donald J. Trump and disparaged presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Director Wray, based on your intelligence at the moment, do you conclude that the Russians still have the same goal and intention to support President Trump in next year's election, as the special counsel's report indicated? And I think that requires a yes or no.
I don't know that I think we have the answer to that at the moment. I think what I would say is the special counsel's report speaks for itself in terms of what it found. And we continue to assess that the Russians are focused on sowing divisiveness and discord in this country and pitting us against each other. And that part, I think, we see alive and well.
But you have no further indication of a preference for a candidate at this point?
I don't think there's anything that I could share at this particular point in time.
Would you commit to making public at a point that you have sufficient information and intelligence that there is a preference by the Russians that is guiding their information operations? I think that would be critical to the American public.
Well, certainly we want to make sure that both the Congress and the American public get the information they need to have. Anytime you start raising hypotheticals involving counterintelligence efforts, I want to be really careful about what I commit to, given my commitment to protecting sources and methods, protecting ongoing investigations, and to protecting our relationships with foreign liaison partners.
It's not about source and methods, Mr. President. I think there's been a lot of criticism previously, and many from our Republican colleagues, that President Obama didn't do enough to alert the American public that there was a concerted effort directed at supporting President Trump, as was established very clearly in the Mueller report. Also, when it was, again, the intelligence communities, their report in 2017, in January 2017, quote, "When it appeared to Moscow that Secretary Clinton was likely to win the presidency, the Russian influence campaign focused more on undercutting Secretary Clinton's legitimacy, including by impugning the fairness of the election." In fact, there was an indictment last year, last October, in the Eastern District of Virginia, of a Kremlin-linked troll group, the Internet Research Agency, posing as Americans, deployed messages about voter fraud through social media throughout the United States. Are you looking at the 2020 election, anticipating another attempt to discredit the credibility and the legitimacy of the election?
We are keenly focused on preparing for the 2020 election in terms of malign foreign influence threat. We expect to see efforts to, as I said, sow divisiveness and discord, and likely efforts to use fake news, propaganda, fake personas, et cetera, which might be done in a way that would be geared towards affecting particular races, but might also be done just to generate chaos. Either way,
but also
we're keenly attuned to it and focused on that.
Undermine the legitimacy of the election. Undermine the legitimacy of the election, which is interesting because President Trump on the campaign trail in 2016 talked about the only way we can lose is if cheating goes on. It's a conscious parallelism, perhaps, or unconscious parallelism, I don't know which, but we are in a position right now where, particularly if their favorite candidate does not prevail, where the Russians will do what they were going to do deliberately in 2016 and suggest that machines have been tampered with, that immigrants have voted illegally. So what respected and legitimate officer of the United States today has been charged with the task, collaborating with the states, because they run these elections, to immediately communicate with the American public on the facts, i.e., there was no machine tampering, there were no illegal immigrants, or, if there are, the specifics of those facts. Without that, we could face a crisis, and a constitutional crisis of immense dimensions. Who's going to do that?
Well, the principal interface between the federal government and state and local election officials is the Department of Homeland Security.
And we
But-
don't have a director, right?
I'm sorry?
And we don't have a director.
Well, we have an acting
Acting
secretary.
okay.
And I think in terms of putting out information, what I've experienced during my 20 months on the job, when it comes to putting out information about election influence or election interference, is that we, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security, all work together in terms of trying to put
my
out
time
public
at the-
messaging.
Has the president directed you or anyone else to be prepared to do this? Because given what we've observed already, it's highly unlikely that he would be in a position, particularly if he was on the other end of the election, the wrong end, to be arbitrary, to be objective and factual and trying to calm the American public rather than to aggravate the situation. Have you been directed, or has he directed you to do that?
We have had, the group that I've described a minute ago, meaning FBI, ODNI, NSA, DHS, and others, have had a number of meetings that, some of which included the president himself chairing them, that have been focused on our efforts on how we can up our game to protect our elections and our democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Director. I want to thank you personally and your entire team for your help in catching the punk that burned 3 of our churches in Louisiana. The perpetrator was caught quickly, and I don't think we could have done that without the assistance of the FBI. And we in Louisiana are very grateful for that. I want to talk to you for a second about 2016. I think we can agree that, at least this is my opinion, that the FBI is the premier law enforcement agency in all of human history. And I think most Americans and most of our friends across the world believe that as well. Unfortunately, there's been created a perception that given the 2 investigations of presidential candidates in 2016, that some members of the FBI allegedly acted on their political beliefs. And I think it's important that we get rid of that perception. We've forgotten also that there were 2 investigations. There was an investigation of President Trump, but also an investigation of Secretary Clinton. I know the Inspector General has weighed in on the Clinton investigation, and he is weighing in on the Trump investigation. But aside from that, can you tell me what the factual predicate was for the investigation of Secretary Clinton and her alleged email scandal?
I don't know that I can say sitting here today what the predicate is. As you mentioned, the independent Inspector General did a fairly intense and rigorous and thorough investigation of that investigation and provided a pretty long report and testified in front of multiple committees of Congress about it. There were a lot of important lessons learned from that, and I think we, the FBI, and I at the helm, took those lessons very much to heart immediately. Some of them we already had in place.
Interrupted, Mr. Director, but I'm going to run out of time, and I don't want to do that. Can you tell me what the factual predicate was for the investigation of President Trump?
Well, the special counsel's report goes through a fair amount of detail about the predication for its investigation. I think beyond that, as I mentioned to the chairman, I've had a number of conversations and I'm working to help the Attorney General get to the bottom of an understanding of what the circumstances surrounding the initiation of that investigation were at the department and the FBI back in 2016.
Why don't you just, I know you can't do this on your own, but the president can. The president could declassify with proper redaction all of the documents at the FBI pertaining to the 2016 investigation of Secretary Clinton and President Trump, and then let the American people see them and draw their own conclusions. Why don't we do that?
Well, without weighing in on the legal question of authority, certainly, I would tell you that when we redact information or when we classify information, there are a number of very, very important principles that are at stake there. Protection of sources and methods, without which Americans are less safe. Protection of ongoing criminal investigations or other investigations, without which the American people are less safe. And there are various other legal issues implicated that go beyond just the power to declassify. And so while I think it's important that we be as transparent as we can be with the American people and certainly with the Congress, I also think it's very important to protect those kinds of information that are the lifeblood of our ability to fulfill our mission.
What are we going to do then, Mr. Director? How do we remove this perception that there were a handful of people at the FBI and at the Justice Department in 2016 that acted on their political beliefs and tried to influence the election? How are we going to lance that boil? And I'm talking about both with respect to the investigations of Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump.
So as to both matters, one case already completed, the other case still underway, there have been independent, so outside the FBI, Inspector General investigations that are professional, that are apolitical, that are rigorous, that are sometimes quite painful for the agency in question. And we've taken a number of steps to learn those lessons from the Clinton email investigation. There have been personnel moves, training improvements, policy improvements, all sorts of things that I laid out in great depth last summer in response to that investigation. And I would expect that we will take to heart in a very similar way whatever lessons are conveyed through the other Inspector General investigation, which is pending. But as to the perception, I think it is important for the American people to understand, and you alluded to it in your very helpful comments at the beginning, that we're talking about two investigations over about a 15-month period, as opposed to the thousands and thousands of investigations that the FBI does to keep Americans safe that are conducted by 37,000 men and women that, in my experience, are brave, professional, rigorous, thoughtful, and I think deserve better than some of the commentary that has been out there. And so I appreciate your comments about the efforts in New Orleans, where there have been some really remarkable efforts made, and I think it would be helpful for everyone to take a deep breath and remember that we've had more than 2 investigations over the last 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Moran, Ranking Member Shaheen. Thank you, Director Wray. It's great to have you before us today. And I want to start by thanking you and the 37,000 men and women of the FBI for their service and devotion to our country and Constitution, and the way that they work every day to keep Americans safe, regardless of race, creed, or political leanings. This work, as we both know, is often dangerous and difficult and underappreciated, and it saves lives. And I think we need to do a better job here of recognizing the professionalism and dedication of the men and women of the FBI. They've recently made a real difference in my home community of Wilmington, Delaware, and just the last 2 months, FBI in Delaware has worked with prosecutors and law enforcement to bring criminal convictions on fraud, bribery, cyber stalking, and narcotics cases. I'm from one of those small towns like Little Rock where violence was spiraling out of control, and real and effective engagement by our FBI office has made a difference in combating that. I look forward to talking more about that, but let me first just, on election interference, I've been encouraged by the clarity with which you've said that foreign interference efforts continue, that you have no doubt that Russia will attempt to interfere again in our next election, that a campaign should immediately contact the FBI if offered dirt on an opponent by a foreign power, and that you've been in meetings with the DNI and with DHS about how to protect our next election. In your remarks, both written and spoken for today's hearing, you highlighted the Foreign Influence Task Force you've created. What more resources do you need to bolster efforts like that task force to better protect our society from foreign interference and specifically our upcoming elections from foreign interference?
Well, Senator, I appreciate the question and be happy to talk about violent crime in Wilmington in particular also. On the foreign influence side, the Foreign Influence Task Force that I described, we basically put that together through existing resources with no additional help from Congress at that point. I think it was a significant success, but we view our adversary, in particular Russia in this context, as upping its game, and we're also expanding our efforts to look at other nation states as well. So we need, and the budget request that we've submitted asks for additional personnel and additional tools to help us get through the volumes and volumes of data. In that sense, this threat is not unlike a lot of the other threats that I've been describing through my testimony, where the mountains of information that come in, I can't underscore, you always hear about the sort of the big data problem. We all hear about that phrase. Well, we've got the big data problem just like everybody else. And the need for speed as matched up against the volume of data is a real concern that I have. And so I think over the next few years, and certainly with this budget, the more that this subcommittee can help us get the personnel and the tools and the data analytics tools that we need, cyber tools that we need, that's the best way we're going to get ahead of this threat.
Well, I look forward to supporting that request because I think you're hearing widespread concern that we do everything we can to ensure the integrity of our election system so that we do not face widespread doubts about that. Let me move to the state and local law enforcement partnership. I like your 2 + 2 = 5, 6, or 7 synergy view. NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, is a key, a central tenet in protecting our country from those who would do us harm. You've said that in your written remarks, and I agree. Senator Toomey and I have introduced a bipartisan bill, the NICS Denial Notification Act, that would require the federal government to notify state and local law enforcement when someone lies and tries. When a person prohibited by law from purchasing a gun, a convicted felon, for example, goes into a gun store, tries to buy, and is denied. There were about, I think, 103,000 NICS denials last year that prevented people from buying guns who shouldn't have to buy them. Could you do that without legislation? Could you, just as a simple matter of a decision about partnership, decide to notify state law enforcement every time someone tries to buy a gun who is a person prohibited? And if not, could I have your support for this legislation that I think is exactly the sort of better enforcement of laws on the books that help state and local law enforcement that we ought to be able to do on a bipartisan basis?
Well, certainly I share your concern about trying to make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of people who are legally prohibited from having them. I do know that as to the legal question of whether we would need legislation to share information, I'm enjoying the role of not being a lawyer right now for the first time in my career. So I will defer to the lawyers on the legal question. But I will say that I do know that anecdotally, because I see it come up in the context of investigations we have, that there are plenty of times where we do share denial information with partners, federal, state, and local, out on the ground in the context of existing investigations, and sometimes it's very useful information, as you say. I would be a little bit concerned about thinking through the resource burden, and this would, of course, resonate, I would think, in particular for you, given the challenges in Delaware, what that would mean for state and local law enforcement if they were suddenly bombarded with all that information, whether they would have the resources necessary to handle that flow.
I'll just say in meetings with the police chiefs of my smaller cities and towns, they would welcome knowing when a resident of their community who is prohibited from buying a weapon has gone in to try and buy a weapon, because that's an excellent predictor that they're then going to go try and acquire a weapon some other way, probably for malign purposes. There are other states where it is the state police who contact the NICS, who conduct the NICS background check initial contact, so they're immediately notified of the denial. Then there's states like my own where that's not the case, where it goes directly from the federally licensed firearm dealer back and forth to the NICS system. I'm just trying to fix a small communication piece that I think really could help keep people safer. I know I'm over my time. I would welcome hearing more from you, Director, about the partnership program, the PSP that you referenced, and how we could strengthen resources for state and local law enforcement to benefit from the FBI. Thank you for your service.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director, for your service. I want to talk to you about domestic terrorism, and I'd like for us to get a better understanding of how the statistics are evolving. I understand, it seems to me we're getting better at reporting sort of white nationalist, white extremist, both hate crimes and also terrorist events. And I'm wondering whether you think, A, do we have an increasing domestic terrorism problem related to white extremism or whatever word you would choose to use?
I think we assess that domestic terrorism, well, let me put the hate crime category to the side for a second, although you're exactly right that there's a lot of blurring between them, sometimes for good reason. But on the domestic terrorism side, what I would say is that we assess that domestic terrorism, including domestic terrorism conducted by people subscribing to some sort of white supremacist ideology, is a serious, persistent threat. I don't know that we've seen a noted increase in the threat, but it is make no mistake, it is a real serious threat, and it's persistent, and we have a lot of investigations, somewhere a little short of 1,000 that go to domestic terrorism, not just that particular type of domestic terrorism, but all domestic terrorism.
The question I have has to do with the allocation of resources, the way you organize your desks, the way agents are assigned, and I just want to be reassured that the resources are allocated according to the risk. And it seems to me that the way the Congress has appropriated money, the way the political ecosystem has evolved since 9/11, and for lots of very good reasons and sound reasons, that the focus has been on external threats, jihad-inspired terrorism, but to the extent that the data demonstrates that white nationalism is something approaching about half of the terrorist events, depending on whether you count individual instances or total number of deaths. Can I be confident that the way you organize your desks and the way you allocate resources are proportional to the data as it comes in? And if the data shows something new, that you can reallocate the resources?
Certainly, we have a whole threat review prioritization process that's designed to help us do the kind of calibration you're talking about. I would say that we very aggressively treat domestic terrorism as a priority through our joint terrorism task forces. And in fact, I think last year, just as one imperfect measure of it, I think we had more domestic terrorism arrests than we did international terrorism arrests. Now, in addition to what we do for the terrorism side, as you mentioned, there's the hate crime side, which we do through our criminal programs, and so there's a lot of times where some of the same kinds of activity can be tackled through the resources we use on that side, too.
Thank you. Let me get to facial recognition. I think it's got lots of potential, but the GAO had a study that recommends that the director conduct tests and to take steps to determine whether systems used by external partners are valid. There was a recent study cited by the New York Times that says that women of color have an error rate of 35% increase in the error rate in terms of these facial recognition databases and softwares. And I'm sort of mixed mind here. I think this provides great potential for you to catch bad guys, but only if the software works. And I have two worries. First, if the software is not ready, that's one thing. Second, if you use third-party contractors and the algorithm is proprietary and you don't know how they're determining who's a risk and who's not, then I think the FBI has an obligation to take a breath and try to figure out how reliable this facial recognition software is. Can you speak to facial recognition generally and the worry that sort of garbage in, garbage out, that these approaches can enhance existing uneven enforcement of the law?
Well, with the caveat up front that I have not had the chance to review the newspaper article that you described or the GAO report that it summarizes, I would say that facial recognition, kind of like you, I view it as a very exciting technology with a lot of promise. I also view it as something that we have to approach thoughtfully to make sure that it's just like any exciting technology, it's not misused. You know, I sometimes say that with all the technology that's out there right now that's changing so fast, I usually have two reactions. Every time there's a new technology, I think, wow, we can do that? And then my second reaction is, oh no, somebody else can do that. And, you know, this is one of those tools that's in that regard. But I think there's a lot of promise to the technology in terms of what it can do to help solve crimes and keep people safe. And we'd be happy to, you know, arrange a briefing for you on a little more detail
I'll
on
do
the
that,
subject.
and in the interest of time, I'll reduce the follow-up to the record, but I do want to understand your response to both the New York Times article and the GAO report. Thank you.
Senator Schatz, thank you. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Thank Director for being here. And I'm not going to ask you to comment about any specific cases, especially in this setting, matters that are highly compartmented, but I do want to point things that are into the public record. The first is, May of last year, the Senate Intelligence Committee, as part of our review of the 2016 election, in an interim report, stated that there had been a number of counties across the country in which foreign actors had been in a position, if they wanted to change and influence voter databases. They didn't do so, but they were in a position to do so. That was disclosed. As you can imagine, a few weeks ago, when the Mueller report came out, it had a brief but obviously significant mention that at least one Florida county had been impacted by an intrusion, and it has elicited, as you can imagine, across our 67 counties, a tremendous amount of attention, to say the least. And I know that you've heard from both my colleague, Senator Scott, and from our new Governor DeSantis. So, the one hand, I explain to people, we are always trying to protect our methods and sources. And so sometimes by revealing information, you have revealed how you learned about it, and thereby compromise the ability to learn about it in the future. On the other hand, you can imagine if you're a county election official anywhere in America, I'm not talking specifically about Florida, and you hear that you may have been potentially one of those impacted and no one's told you that directly, it puts them in a very difficult position. So just thinking through, well, how can we handle a matter, and these are just hard things, and sometimes it's not entirely the FBI's decision to make, or any other agency for that matter, but I think I've described sort of just writ large. Let's just back up from Florida and just say writ large. That's a tough spot to be in, other than to tell people, if you do these things, you should be fine, but we can't tell you who it is that's been impacted because we'll lose the ability to learn about it in the future. Is there any thought being given to how to confront this in the future, the balance between notifying a county or a victim of this sort of intrusion and the ability to protect our methods and sources?
So I think you've identified a particularly vexing problem, as you've, I think, correctly framed. It is something that we in the intelligence community struggle with quite a bit. We have tried to put in place a fairly specific protocol that is intended to guide a thoughtful and disciplined decision-making process for when we notify victims of a cyber attack, whether it's in the election context or anything else. And it goes through a lot of the considerations that would apply. So things ranging from, and you anticipated some of them in your question, sometimes the information is a particularly sensitive source or method. And if we lose or jeopardize that source or method, then we lose the ability to even better protect sometimes even the same victim. Sometimes the information comes from a trusted foreign liaison partner. And it's not our decision to make about whether to share the information. Sometimes it affects an ongoing criminal investigation and might jeopardize that. So there's a whole host of things. We also look at things like how actionable is the information? Is the information we've had in a form where somebody could even do something with it? And so sometimes those factors come into attention and we try to wrestle through them as best we can. I will say that sometimes we also strike a middle ground, which is we try to provide more general information to help people take appropriate cyber hygiene steps. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a solution that intends to kind of have it a little bit both ways, where we're sharing information that allows people to take some steps while it's still protecting some of those sensitive sources of information. But this is an issue that we all in the intelligence community struggle with, not just in the election context, but in a lot of other settings as well.
One final question on a different topic. 15 months ago, as you know, the tragedy took place in Parkland, and as you've acknowledged and others, the FBI made some mistakes. There was clear tips that were disregarded about how the shooter was a threat to the lives of others. There was a commitment to a review of the policies and procedures, but so far there hasn't been anything public in terms of accountability aside from acknowledging the mistakes. So what is the status of that review?
So we have done not one but two fairly in-depth reviews out at our call center, which is where the key activity occurred. We've changed training, we've changed policies out there, we've doubled, not doubled, but we've increased significantly the amount of resources that are out there. We've increased the amount of oversight. We've built certain technology tools to improve, sort of put redundancies in the process to ensure that the right kinds of things are caught. There's a whole host of things we've done. In addition, I've met with some of the victims, families of some of the victims, as has the deputy director, and we're committed to trying to get this right. We've now recently, and this is very recent information, but I've now put in charge of that whole division out there in West Virginia, one of our senior-most executives to run that division, somebody that we personally enlisted to really bring the right level of maturity and sophistication to running that whole division. I think that's a measure of how important this is to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you very much for attending in your service. Sir, you know, as I look and see a troubled world in a divided country, the only thing that separates us from other countries in the world is the rule of law. People must believe, and they're going to be treated fair no matter who you are, what rung of life you might be on. After Mr. Barr's appearance last week, there were still some unanswered questions. But the one thing was asked to him, would he have a problem with Mr. Mueller appearing? And he says, no, he didn't have a problem with that at all. Do you think that would be helpful for Mr. Mueller to appear before Congress, or would you have a problem with that?
Well, I won't purport to speak for Special Counsel Mueller. I've had nothing but good experiences working with him over the years, and nothing but good experiences working with the current Attorney General.
Do you think it'd be helpful if he did appear before us so we could clear up? It would be helpful to me, as someone who voted for Mr. Barr, and leaving a lot of questions unanswered, to hear Mr. Mueller's report, and basically from himself.
You know, that's really a decision between the Special Counsel, the Department, and the Congress.
Also, on redaction, the report was 448 pages. What's the average, when these reports come out, what would you consider an average percentage of that being redacted, that usually because of ongoing investigations, things that might still be pending?
I'm not sure that I've ever heard of a sort of average percentage of redaction. I think
this one was about 10%.
Really
this one was 44 pages. So I'm saying, does that seem high, or there's an awful lot going on still yet we don't know about?
Well, I think the Special Counsel report does identify that there have been a number of referrals, and there are a number of ongoing investigations that grew out of that. The figure 10%, I don't know if that's the right figure, but I'll take your word for it. Certainly, I've seen lots of documents submitted to Congress, and you probably have too through your time on the Senate Intelligence Committee, that have been much more heavily redacted than that.
Sir, I'm going to switch to opiates right now. The state of West Virginia has been extremely hard hit, as you know. We lead the nation as far as the deaths per thousand. It's just a horrendous situation, and millions and millions and millions of pills that the companies, basically from the manufacturers to the distributors, have poured into my country and my state's unbelievable. We have one little town, Kermit, West Virginia, where over 9 million pills were shipped in. There's 392 people live in that town. You can do the math. It's the thousands and thousands per person. It makes no sense at all. But when there's a deal made, basically, and they have an agreed upon amount that they're going to pay restitution, we're not able to get, and especially if they don't admit to guilt towards the wrongdoing, we can't get the information. Basically, at that time, the courts say, well, that belongs back to the company, or we'll destroy them, and we have no public records. And we know the intent cannot be for a health outcome when you're sending 9 million pills to a town of 392 people. Is there any way that can be stopped, or we can reverse that so we can get some information on the intent of what they're doing and how to stop that?
So I'm not familiar with the specific impediment that you're describing. I'm happy for my staff to take a closer look at that.
They would look at it. We have
Yeah.
one right now with McKesson. McKesson basically settled with the state of West Virginia for $37 million. And basically, they sent 5 million pills to this little town, as they were one of the biggest distributors of pills all over my state. And to let them off is just absolutely criminal as far as in my mind from what they did to our state. So I'm trying to get the information. I cannot get it since they did not have to prove any wrongdoing when the settlement was made, and it put us in a really onerous position to ever stop them from doing it, to continue to do it. If you could help me with that, I would be most appreciative.
Well, I'd be happy to take a look at it. Not, like I said, not familiar with the specific issue. I do know that we have done a big surge on the opioid issue, and specifically on the provider part of it in your region. And we just had a huge takedown. There are our
Oh, no, you all been there, and I appreciate it. My last question is going to be on CFIUS, sir. From the CFIUS, what we have, and maybe from your perspective, we have an awful lot of assets that are not required to go through CFIUS for the United States. I'll give you an example: propane, ethane, butane, all the different building blocks to manufacturing. Foreign investments can buy them up and gobble them all up, and we have no recourse whatsoever. So should most Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States filings remain a voluntary process, or can we change that to make it mandatory? Reciprocating is what I'm looking for. Basically, we can't go to China and own the assets that they own in America.
So I do think that the CFIUS process is not only indispensable where it applies, but the Congress, and I'm grateful to the Congress for this, recently expanded and improved the effectiveness of CFIUS. But I think you're also exactly right that the ability to channel foreign investment into this country with an improper motive is something that is a real challenge for this country. And so while a number of loopholes were closed with the recent reform that occurred to CFIUS, I think we're going to have to keep looking for more ways to close more loopholes, because I think this is going to be a bigger and bigger problem for us as a nation.
Thank you.
Director, thank you very much. Senator Capito, we need to be done here by 11 in order to have time for a classified briefing. So again, if we can shorten our questions and answers.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here. I wanted to begin by thanking you of something that's not in the budget. In the past, the budget has called for rescissions that would impact the work at CGIS and the men and women in our Clarksburg facility in Clarksburg, West Virginia. So thank you for not calling for that. But shifting focus to something that is in the budget, there is a $4 million increase for additional positions in Clarksburg. Can you describe what kinds of works they're going to be doing?
Well, certainly we feel both excited about the growth that we're trying to have out at CGIS and concerned about the need to address all the different functions that occur out there. The impact, in some ways, I think CGIS is one of those divisions, probably the most impact on the American people that people know the least about. You know, between the 10 million times a day that we're providing criminal justice information to state and local law enforcement, between the 26 million gun checks that NICS did last year, between the 190-something thousand fingerprints that they process through NGI every day, through the call center, NTOC, which I think had over 1 million tips between calls and emails last year. And so we need to kind of keep pace. The volume just keeps growing, and so the positions and the other allocations in the budget, I think, will be important to helping us do that.
Let me ask a follow-up on that. I know that I went to a ribbon cutting out there, which is an agreement between the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense to sort of merge some of their, well, not merge, but to use resources together out there. How has that been progressing? I don't know from your standpoint. How's that been working, that partnership?
I think it's been working pretty well, but I will confess I haven't gotten an update recently on that.
All right, you know, we did pass the Fix NICS Act, and I'm wondering how the implementation of that has gone in terms of being more precise with the data and closing some of those loopholes that we did in Fix NICS.
Well, certainly, I think we get better all the time in terms of our ability to keep pace with the volume of gun checks that we have to do. I do think it's the reality. I think we had almost the highest number of checks we had to run in history last year, maybe the second highest in history. So I've actually gone out and visited the folks there. I've sat down and put the headset on so I could listen to experience what it's like to be doing those gun checks as a NICS operator. So it's incredibly important work that they're doing.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up again on Senator Manchin's question, both of us being from West Virginia, on the fentanyl and heroin. I know that you've put a lot of resources into this. I know that you've worked on closing up the prescription loopholes and going after providers. The situation at the southern border is such that, I mean, I feel that there's still a proliferation of illegal drugs coming through our ports of entry. Do you work with the Border Patrol to try to, I know you get into transcontinental or trans-country cartels and all that. How do you information share so that we can prevent this? Because this is killing people.
Well, we have a number of task forces where we work closely with Border Patrol agents. Certainly, this is a problem that requires both skill sets and both agencies' expertise. I come back to my 2 + 2 to get 5 or 6 paradigm. We focus kind of on dismantling the enterprises, but they have enormous eyes and ears on the ground, and I think we have a great relationship with the Border Patrol, and we're incredibly grateful for the very hard job they do.
Are you able to stay ahead of them, though? I mean, it seems like they're obviously very creative, very wealthy on the other side. I'm talking about the cartels. What kinds of resources are you lacking that you think you can break these up so that we can stop this illegal trafficking?
Well, we always need more bodies and more tools. The transnational organized criminal activity that we see now is not just the drug trafficking. It's diversified into all kinds of other activity. There, like in the other threat areas I've described, there's a data analytics piece of it. In order for us to be more agile, we need to work in closer partnership with the countries that are south of us in order to try to make sure that they take their share of the responsibility. We've had some great successes in that regard in Central America in particular, in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Van Hollen, the most patient of our
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Director Wray, and thank you and the men and women of the FBI for all you do for our country. We've had a lot of talk this morning about Russian interference in our elections. You and the Intelligence Committee have been very clear. Mueller report emphatically puts the exclamation point on it that Russians interfered in 2016. You've also said recently that Russian interference in the previous elections was, quote, just a kind of dress rehearsal for the big show in 2020. And seems to me if we know that, we should be doing everything in our power to both prepare for it but also try to deter it. We should try to harden our systems. We should deal with malign influence. We should try to, prevent the cyber hacking. But would you agree that the best defense would be an ability to deter that kind of interference in the first place? In other words, if Putin understood that the costs of interfering in our election outweigh the relatively low costs he's facing right now, should we explore that option?
Well, certainly, I think the best part of a defense against a foreign intelligence threat like malign foreign influence includes an offensive capability. Sometimes people say the best defense is a good offense. There's a degree to which that applies in this setting. A lot of what would be appropriate there is not the kind of thing that we would be discussing in an open hearing, but certainly we work jointly with others, and I will say that appreciate you reminding me of my recent comments in this topic. We have significantly increased, again, just based on resources we already have, not new resources, our own footprint on the foreign influence. So far from sort of stepping back after the midterms and saying, thank goodness that's over, we've actually stepped it up a notch and tried to figure out, okay, how do we learn the things that worked well in 2018 and kind of get ready for 2020?
I got it. So I think, and you hinted at, look, my personal view is we should be very proactive when it comes to cyber offense, but I'm also talking about a piece of legislation Senator Rubio and I have introduced called the Deter Act, which lays out front, very big penalties, sticks that the Russian economy would face if we catch them interfering in our elections going forward. So up front, if you're Putin, if you interfere, if we catch you, you're going to see these penalties. Secretary Pompeo was in front of one of the appropriations subcommittees recently. I asked him if he'd support something like that going forward. His answer, quote, I would. I know the outlines of the Deter Act, and conceptually, I think it makes sense. Do you agree, and can you work with us on refining that legislation?
We'd be happy to work with you on the legislation, see if there's operational impact information we can share that would be useful to you as you tweak or move forward. Certainly, sanctions are a very important tool in the toolbox that can and should be and has been in some instances applied in this particular space that we're talking about right now. So happy to work with you.
The idea here is instead of acting after the fact, right? Instead of trying to apply sanctions after the fact, you make it clear up front what sanctions will automatically come down to try to influence behavior. The FBI was helpful in Maryland last year on a number of fronts, but specifically identified that one of the vendors that oversaw some of our elections infrastructure was actually controlled by a company where a Putin oligarch had a controlling interest. The good news is because we monitored that with your help, there was no interference in Maryland's specific election. But Senator Collins and I and others have introduced legislation making it clear that no part of U.S. elections infrastructure, including at the state level, should be controlled in whole or in part by a foreign adversary. Does that sound like common sense to you?
I think you've put your finger on what we sometimes, it's a permutation of what we call sometimes the supply chain threat, which applies not just to Russians, but other foreign adversaries. And it's a real concern for this country. I appreciate your comments about the good work in Baltimore. I've actually been out to visit that office twice, just in my short time on the job, met with all the employees, met with our partners there, community partners there as well. And there's really, really exciting, great work being done by that office that I'm very proud of.
Just in conclusion, do you agree that we should prohibit foreign adversaries from owning or controlling any part of our elections infrastructure?
Well, certainly as framed, that makes pretty good sense to me. I'd have to look at the particulars of any legislation, certainly.
All right. Look forward to working with you.
Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, I think you're doing a great job. Tell everybody in your organization we appreciate what they do for the country. Sequestration, if it kicks back in, what kind of effect would it have on the FBI?
Senator, if sequestration were to kick back in, I think, in short, it would be devastating.
Would be less safe as a nation?
I think there would be, it would have a negative impact on the safety of the American people.
All the things that we've been talking about here would be undermined in terms of the role you play.
Virtually all of them, yes.
Yeah. When it comes to deterring Russian interference in the American election, is it working, or should we do more?
Well, I tend to be dissatisfied by nature, so I always think we can do more and should do more on pretty much every threat we've described here. But I will say,
the Russians have gotten the message, or there's still more messages to be sent?
I think there are still more messages to be sent.
Other than Russia, what nation state should we be worried about in 2020?
Well, I think there are a number of our adversaries, China, Iran, North Korea, who all have different ideas about foreign influence. They all pursue different tools in their toolbox, but I think all of those adversaries, just as you and I have discussed in the past, are things that we need to be worried about across the foreign influence front.
Okay, so sequestration would be devastating. We need to send more messages to Russia about what they've done and will do, not less. You gave us a list of other countries to worry about. Are you familiar with the two terrorists called the Beatles that are in custody in Syria by the Syrian Democratic Forces?
I am. I mean, not every detail about it, but certainly familiar.
These are two of the four terrorists described as the Beatles because they were British. They were working with ISIS. Two of them have been captured. They're accused of being involved in the beheading of Mr. Foley, an American citizen, and some others. Could you give this committee a status on those cases, what the plan is in terms of bringing them to justice? You don't have to do it here in opening hearing, but let us know. I think all of us want to make sure these people do not break out and they're brought to justice.
Well, I think as you anticipated, there's probably not a whole lot I can say in this setting on that. I will say that this is a very important case to us, to me personally. I've actually met with a number of the family members of some of the victims. I think this part is public. We certainly are in appropriate coordination with our British counterparts about whether or not there's a way to ensure that these folks can be brought to justice. But if there's one thing the FBI is known for, it's not giving up.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and please, I know you won't give up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Graham, thank you for joining us. Director Wray, anything you'd like to add in this open setting to any of the questions, expand any of your answers, or anything we've missed that you'd like to highlight for us?
Not that I can think of. We covered a lot of ground.
Director, thank you. On Friday of this week, I will give a graduation address at the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center. Would you care to share any thoughts you have about what should be said to 60 new men and women who are becoming members of the law enforcement community?
I think I would tell them that they're undertaking not an ordinary job, but a calling. That it takes a very, very, very special kind of person who's willing to put his or her life on the line to protect complete strangers, and that the whole country is grateful for their service.
I'll try to deliver that message with those kind words. If there are no further questions in this morning's hearing, the open portion of our hearing, senators may submit additional questions for the subcommittee's record. We request the FBI respond within 30 days. The subcommittee now stands in recess, and we will reconvene momentarily in a closed and classified session to hear from Director Wray in Senate Visitor Center 217. Thank you.
How are you? It's kind of interesting at first. Yeah. He doesn't like to make news. I'm Todd Ruger with CQ Roll Call.